Hello everyone, I'm Irma Baker. Welcome to our show. We have a very interesting topic this morning, and well, let's say some of you may be dealing with it on your own. So I'm very happy to welcome to RSVP Christine Dunmoyer. Christine is going to tell us about her book and how it is to live with macular degeneration. Christine, it's so wonderful to have you with us. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you so much for the invitation. This is really a great opportunity for me to talk to some people who might be dealing with this issue.
And you've dealt with it now for how long?
Well, I was diagnosed in 2000, so the math is easy, 23 years.
23 years. Oh my gosh. And I'm sure it came as a shock to you when you were told you have macular degeneration.
I was. So certainly my story is not typical. I first went to an eye doctor because my sister told me to. She was having some vision issues and wanted to make sure that the family didn't have anything inherited. And so all four of us had to get checked out, my sister and both of my parents. And I actually noticed something wrong when I did something during the evaluation of the eye doctor's regular events, let's say. And I did something called the Amsler grid. And when I first looked at the Amsler grid, which is a white background with a black grid on it, a very simple test, I didn't see all of the grid. And so what I was told to do is make a mark wherever I couldn't see it, which would indicate visual field losses or something. And when I first looked at it, I was missing kind of the very middle section of the grid.
So it just looked blank to you, that section?
The lines were not there. Yes, like my brain knew that the lines should be there, but I couldn't see the lines. And so the way I describe it initially is it felt like I was looking through a donut hole. And so like if I could put my hands up, like that rim was missing for me. And up until that point, I had no idea. My brain had been filling in those differences. And then over the years, after the diagnosis, that donut hole became filled in. So now my brain has to fill in that entire space when I'm looking straight in the center of my vision. Does that make any sense?
It's a complicated subject.
It is.
How would you describe it to somebody who's maybe heard the words but just never understood it? What's the layman's description?
So macular degeneration means that the center of your vision, the macula, has died. And there might be some functional photoreceptors, but the majority of those cells are no longer working. And since the center of your vision or central vision loss is not working, that means that it's really hard to see fine details. It's difficult to read. And even though I can see peripherally quite well, it's that central portion that I have to guess a lot when I'm trying to see up close.
Oh, well, we have a picture of the eyeball. Why don't we take a look at the picture of the eyeball, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about what's involved.
Okay, so light enters through the cornea. It's refracted to the lens, which is kind of the upper middle portion, and then the lens will refract it or bend the light rays further to the back of the eye. The back of the eye is called the retina. The retina is just full of neurons, which are cells that have special abilities to send messages, and the cells that actually detect the light are cleverly called photoreceptors. We also know them as the rods and the cones. The rods are useful for detecting dim light settings, and the cones only detect color.
Yeah, I think we have a picture of receptors too, don't we?
We might have a picture of some photoreceptors.
This one?
So in my book, I found an illustrator, and the illustrator is named Bryce Olson. He was actually one of my former students, and then he went on to optometry school. So when I asked him when I was writing the book, could you possibly draw me some pictures of the eye, he said no problem. So on the left is the cone, because it really does resemble the cone head, and on the right those are the rods, and each of the upper portions of the rod, all of those are just jam full of molecules that are able to detect light. They're called rhodopsin. And when the cells die, they obviously can't detect light anymore. In the case of macular degeneration, most people have, I shouldn't say most, I should say in humans, we have rods in our periphery, and we have some rods in our macula. But most of the cones are located in the macula. And so one of the issues with macular degeneration, not only do you lose all of the fine vision because of the circuits and connections for the cones, you might also lose some color detection. And we call that color deficiency, not so much color blindness, because I can still see colors, I just don't see all the colors as well as I used to.
Oh, it sounds like a very complicated subject, and you've really done a lot of research on it. Is that one of the ways that you coped with your diagnosis?
Yes, for me, I was finishing graduate school and I had been studying diabetes, and it's a great topic, but I was no longer 100% convinced that's what I wanted to do for my career. And when the vision diagnosis happened, I wanted to learn more about the eye. I wanted to learn more what I could do about my disease, but I didn't want to study my disease specifically. So it just so happened that I ended up in a lab that was studying vitamin A metabolism, and vitamin A is important in the disease. A couple years after I started working in the lab, we learned that vitamin A and my particular disease, Stargardt disease, are a bad combination. If you take too much vitamin A, it can make your eyes, or rather your photoreceptors, degenerate even faster. So lesson learned in my case, vitamin A was something I should avoid. I feel like I'm getting off topic a little bit. Kind of to sum up, I wanted to study my disease, but I didn't want to study my specific disease. And that's kind of how I led my career since then.
And at the same time that you were making these career changes, or your future career, because you were in graduate school at the time? You were in graduate school. You were dealing with actually grief.
Right. So the interesting thing for me is that when I was first diagnosed with a vision disease, my symptoms were really, really mild. And so it wasn't until 5 or even 8 years later that my symptoms really progressed to the point where I needed to find different visual aids and different devices to help me do my job. But initially it was all grief, right? That first summer when I was diagnosed, I probably cried a number of times every day, kind of in between work, and as soon as I got home from work I would cry. Just, you have to go through the grieving stages. I don't know if there's a quick way to go through it.
One of the things that I found very interesting in your book was the fact that grief is not a one-time occurrence. You found that grief repeated. You had repeated times when grief really took you. So each time that I would go to the eye doctor and my vision would change, I would grieve for what I had just lost. So when I hit, so if we talk about visual acuity, for most people we say normal is 20/20 vision. When I was first diagnosed, my vision was 20/25, barely not quite normal. And then over the years it progressed. When I hit 20/40, I grieved. When I hit 20/50, I grieved. So it was
steps in the process, but I also knew that it was a progressive disease. It was going to get worse. And so I knew that as much as I wanted to deny what was happening to me, I had to somehow think about the future. And I continued to want to push it away and deny it. So at 2050, I knew the next step was soon I wouldn't be driving. And then when the not driving happened, that was devastating because I had not prepared for it.
And you were going into something that you didn't know how to prepare for.
Right, right. So if I could do it all over again, I would have connected earlier with a low vision doctor. And low vision doctors will help patients in my situation with finding devices to help do daily tasks. So that was really, really helpful when I finally found the low vision doctor. But what I look back on, I think, couldn't someone have told me about that doctor sooner? That would have been very helpful. Second, I should have connected with local blind agencies sooner. I didn't know anybody else who was blind, and the more I denied it, the more I avoided blind people. Mm-hmm. And once I stopped driving, once I really hit that final grief stage, that's when I realized that I could learn from other people. Mm-hmm. I couldn't just do it on my own.
And it affected all of your life. It affected things like where you lived, what you did, what were those kinds of things what were those impacts on your life?
Certainly transportation was a big issue. I happened to stop driving when I lived in Pennsylvania. I was living in a small town that had what I would consider a very minimal bus system, but they had a bus system. Mm-hmm. And I learned about walking everywhere. I learned when the bus schedule happened. But even, like I mentioned, the denial stage, I didn't realize that a bus even existed until I stopped driving. And a friend of a friend took me on the bus route. I didn't even know those things. Mm-hmm. Like I didn't seem to even have the ability to look up on a website, how do I get around this town? So those are, things I can reflect on now and say, gee, I wish I had, taken more action, but I just didn't seem capable of it back mm-hmm. then. So transportation's a big issue. For a lot of the jobs that I took, I had to decide how close do I need to live to my job. And so when I was teaching in Tennessee, I used to live about 3 miles away from the campus. I realized that because I like to work into the dark, that wouldn't be very conducive to my work situation, so I decided that I would move closer to campus. And so for about 5 or 6 years, I had a house really close to campus. All I had to do was walk from my house to campus, and it was a really short walk. I didn't have to worry about driving at night, because one of the things with macular degeneration is that you should not drive at night unless a doctor recommends it. And certainly in my case, I am night blind. I've never been in any car accidents due to it, but I realized early enough that it wouldn't be safe for me to drive at mm-hmm. night. Mm-hmm.
I'm going to switch topics just because you brought up driving. How do you drive?
So,
I mean, you're living in Ohio now, and Ohio does allow.
I do. So, in a nutshell, I stopped driving in 2011, and for 5.5 years, I did not drive. I learned about public transportation. I would take Amtrak. I would take Greyhound. I would ask people to give me rides. But one of the doctors in Pennsylvania knew that I had a connection to Ohio, my then boyfriend, now husband, and he suggested that I get checked out by a low vision doctor in Ohio. So that doctor told me about this program, and Ohio's had it for more than 20 years. Pennsylvania is finally on board and has joined the 21st century, and they've just recently passed legislation to allow this training. So the training is called Bioptic Driver Training Program. That's a mouthful. And what are bioptics? So I have an example here. These are a pair of regular glasses, and then a telescope is attached to it, to the glasses frame. And then the telescope is positioned specifically for me, just like glasses are specifically for each person. I have a teeny window of decent vision in my left eye, and that telescope is positioned so that I can see just through that tiny little island of good vision. So here are my driving glasses. Ta-da! So when I'm looking straight ahead through the no power glass lenses, I'm wearing my contact lenses, my acuity is 20/110. So that means, I'll talk about the numbers in a minute. When I dip down and look through the telescope, I can see 20/40. So what that means is I've just added 70 feet of vision to my eyes just by looking through the telescope. Now, you can only be in the telescope for 1 second. So I have to know when I'm driving exactly what I need to look for in the distance. What I use it for when I'm driving is reading the green destination signs. Which lane do I want to be in to when I'm driving on a highway?
Rather important information.
It is. Of course, GPS does a pretty good job telling you which lane to get into, but it's nice to read the signs that are available. I don't need it to read the stop sign. I can see that there's a red thing in the distance, and that's probably a stop sign. I have really good peripheral vision. I have very good contrast sensitivity, but it's that distance signs that it's really helpful with. So it adds 70 feet of effective vision to my eyes while I'm driving. So part of the training, I had to learn how often do I use the telescope, at what times is it appropriate, that sort of thing. And then throughout the training process, after I proved that I could use it effectively, then I had to go through 20 hours of actual in-person driver training. And then after I passed that hurdle, I had to have 2 highway patrol officers in my vehicle while I took the driver test. So most people, when they take the test, they have 1 highway patrol. I had 2. But that's how Ohio does it, and it works really, really well.
So Ohio has accommodated drivers who have the ability and the equipment to make driving possible.
They have. So I don't want to say Ohio was the first state, but they were probably in the first 10 states that started to accept the bioptic driving. And California was one of the leaders, but Pennsylvania was one of the last ones, right? So we have a couple thousand of bioptic drivers in Ohio, and I'm one of them. Mm-hmm. So the stipulation for driving, I had to get an optometrist to approve my vision every year for a few years, and once they considered it stable, now I have a regular driver's license that gets updated every 4 years, apparently like everybody else. So.
Which gave you the freedom, or gives you the freedom, to move around and lifts a little bit of the restrictions and the challenges of your condition.
It absolutely gives me more independence and choice in life. It's not the end of the world to not drive, but that is certainly what I felt when I wasn't driving. But now I can drive in daylight hours. Mm-hmm. And not being able to drive at night is still a limitation, but it's not a huge limitation. Mm-hmm. And just to be able to say, hey, I forgot an ingredient for my recipe, let me go to the grocery store, that's a convenience. And it's something I didn't have for 5 years, right?
All the adjustments you had to make, what kind of aids were available to you? One of them obviously was the bioptic lens, but what other kind of adjustments and aids did you face, and how did you overcome them?
So this little device, which I've taped because I've dropped it a couple of times, this is what I call a handheld magnifier. And this was my first device that a low vision doctor recommended. It's still my favorite because it still works. This is basically a lens that's a 2.5 magnification. And so with contacts or no contacts, I have trouble reading this page. But if I put my 2.5 magnifier up next to it, I can read it. And so this way, I don't always have to ask the person who's printed me a piece of paper, can you enlarge this for me? I can just bring my device and read it myself. This is useful when I go to restaurants. This is useful when I'm shopping. This is not something I use to drive. Another device I have found is this dude. I found this about 1.5 years ago. It's called a mini CCTV. The CCTV stands for closed circuit television. I think of it just as an enlarged version of a camera.
What we have on the screen right now is the one you have at home.
Yes. So when I was a faculty member, when I taught college, I had a lot of reading, I had a lot of grading, and so I would use this device. This is in the ballpark of $3,000, so it's not a cheap device like this handheld one, but that would allow me to read journal articles, read student writing, read just about everything in the college world. Plus, I now read books for enjoyment this way. So I just put the piece of paper or book onto a shelf and then project the camera at it, and then it's projected onto a monitor. And at 1 or 2 buttons, I can enlarge it so that I can read it. The only downside to that device is that you can't transport it easily. It's got to be kind of on a desk. And so thank you for presenting that. This is a mini CCTV, and this is a handheld device. It has a light, and it does the same basic thing. It's got a screen, and it's got a couple of options in terms of magnification. The downside about that is it's still in the $800 range. So $100, $800, but they offer different things. And so when I described to my low vision doctor what my issues were, what I needed to read, where I needed to move to, that sort of thing, they were able to find different devices for me. So the low vision doctor really has a clue as to what are the right devices for different people. I personally don't do much sewing, but I know that they offer people different devices for close tasks like sewing and how do you find the needle, but those are not items that I ever needed to ask about.
Well, what tips would you give for someone who feels they may have or knows that they have some kind of vision deficiencies?
I mean, the first tip would be see an eye doctor. I am not an eye doctor. I just happen to be a vision researcher who knows a lot about it. But I have not seen your eyes. So certainly go to an eye doctor and find a doctor that you trust. I have spoken with various people and they're not always happy with their doctor. So my advice is go find a better doctor. They do exist, and most eye doctors really do care about their patients. So once you've figured out what the actual vision issue is, once if there is a treatment plan, that's one step. But in terms of what else can I suggest, find other people with a similar disease. In my case, I was diagnosed at 27 with a condition called Stargardt disease. What that is an inherited form of macular degeneration. Most of the people who have age-related macular degeneration, or AMD, they're over the age of 50. For a long time, I didn't think I had anything in common with those people. It's the same macular degeneration, but it was a different cause. The more I've learned is that we have very similar symptoms. The cause might be different. In my case, it's a faulty gene. In their case, it could be genetic, it could be environmental. And so with AMD, the great majority of those folks have a form called dry AMD, which means that with age, their photoreceptors have started to die. It could be a genetic cause, it could be an environmental cause. In a severe form of dry AMD, they call it geographic atrophy. If you were to look at my eyes and their eyes with geographic atrophy, to the eye doctor, they look virtually the same. So once I learned that, I realized we had a lot more in common. Sure, our age was different, but our symptoms were very much the same. And that's partly why I wrote the book, to address more dry AMD, because we're all going through the same basic problems.
Well, let me ask you this. How can people get your book?
Okay, so the book came out in August of 2022. It's available at Barnes & Noble. It's available at Amazon, and that's the print form. It is also available in audio form. That came out in February of 2023. So the audiobook is available at the 3 regular places. So that would be Audible, iTunes, and Amazon. A friend of mine has told me you can find it on Kindle, and I don't know enough about ebooks, but I'm told that you can find ebooks as well. And basically, if you're interested, go out and purchase one, because I really think that it'll help people who are dealing with this issue, as well as friends and family of those patients.
Well, I believe that just your talking with us today is also a wonderful help for anyone who is dealing with this. So, Christine, thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you, everyone, for watching RSVP. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
You are watching WCTV, Wadsworth Community Television.